myself. I'm Willis Jenkins. I teach social ethics here at Yale Divinity School, and my role here is only to sit between these two and help us have an intelligible conversation and go to lunch with something to talk about. I'm going to first introduce Jonathan Schell. He'll talk for 10 or so minutes, and then I'll introduce Mr. Granoff. So let me start with Mr. Schell. He's a senior fellow with the Nation Institute and was a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine from 1967 to 1987. He's the author of many books, including The Fate of the Earth, which many of you know as seminal for exactly this conversation. That was published in 1982. Also, The Unconquerable World, Power, Nonviolence, and the Will of the People. His most recent work is The Seventh Decade, The New Shape of Nuclear Danger, published in 2007. He was a distinguished visiting fellow at Yale Center for the Study of Globalization in 2005 and is currently a visiting lecturer in international relations at Yale College. Mr. Schell, welcome.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. I had an office just across the street there in Bet's house, so I feel at home on top of this hill. Anyway, I'm just going to offer a few exploratory words regarding what, for me at least, is perhaps a slightly new angle of vision on the development of the nuclear age, which is now indeed in its 7th decade. And I hope that this might be useful, especially because our topic, quite frankly, has sort of slid out of public view, and we need to find a way to summon it back. So I hope that this may contribute to that effort. The explosions of 1945 at Alamogordo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki turn out, as we can now see, to have inaugurated something even more comprehensive than the nuclear age. I might call it the age of extinctions. I use the plural because at first it seemed that it was only our own extinction that was on the agenda. And so the matter was an all-human affair, a collective version of Hamlet's to be or not to be. All that was true, but there was more. And this more began to emerge in the early 1960s, notably with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, as we realized that other species, too, were at risk of extinction by human hands. And now we're told by the scientific community that fully half of existing species are at risk of destruction by the end of this century. We tend to forget it now, but Carson began her book by quoting Albert Schweitzer, who said, "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth." That was in the context of the ecological problems way back in the beginning of the 1960s. So she had an inkling of what I'm talking about now. So I'd say that the nuclear question by now really takes its place as one, the most severe, the most extreme, the most incredible, but only one of the instruments of catastrophe with which human beings threaten the natural foundations of all life, including, of course, human life on Earth. Now, I think that there were reasons that this essential unity of these threats, surpassing any in history, was not seen early on. And one is that the nuclear weapon issue appeared in the context of war, whereas the ecological questions were what we call ecological, because really the nuclear is the king of the ecological dangers, first cropped up or were first noticed in an economic context. And the first, war, had always seemed to be something destructive, and this was a sort of raising of that to a new power, to a new magnitude, whereas the second, economic activity, was seen as productive. But it turned out that production was also destructive. And I think something of this fact is caught in the phrase by Joseph Schumpeter that is often used, creative destruction, regarding the actions of the capitalist economy. And what he meant, of course, is that new works of capitalism devastate the old. The steamship sends the sailing ship to the bottom of the seas. The rise of agribusiness shutters the family farm. But in fact, as we know now, this destructive side of production cuts deeper into the underlying support systems of life. And actually, there's a third dimension of this, which I won't discuss, but is just emerging now, and that is the creation, of course, of new organisms through genetic tampering. This power is not, unfortunately, a power to restore, but a true power to create, raising questions as deep as our destructive powers, but as I say, I'll leave that aside. Now, I just want to take a moment to try to reflect for a second on what I think is the nature of this new age of extinctions, or age of extinction, as you will. Because obviously we're dealing with something here that, taken all together, is entirely new in historical terms. And so we have to step way back from it and try to see what's going on. And here are just a few thoughts towards that end. The defining feature of any act of extinction is not the death of living individuals, horrible as that is, but the cancellation of the unborn generations. Acts of extinction, although usually accompanied by slaughter in the present, are thus assaults essentially upon the future. Whether we are speaking of genocide, the extinction of humankind, or the extinction of other species and ecosystems, however, the critical distinction is between that which is created and the power that creates it, between the loom and the cloth, the dye and the product, or to put it in religious terms, between God the Maker and nature. Indispensable to the powers that sustain the regeneration of life, human or other, are certain stable patterns or forms which carry through the generations. And these forms that underlie individual species, the genomes, are the most sharply defined, of course. The forms that underlie ecosystems, the fixed or slow changing interrelationships among species, are likewise physically definable. The stable forms that underlie the cultures and traditions of people cannot be so easily identified, but are no less real for that. They give to culture some of the orderliness found in the regeneration of organisms, which may account for Voltaire's saying, "La politesse est une force de la nature," politeness is a force of nature. It is the integrity and perdurance of these life forms, which are truly the books of life, that endow each kind, whether this is one of the peoples that make up the human species itself, other species, or ecosystems, with an immortality that is unshared by their individual members. And that is why it is appropriate to speak of an extinction as a second death. For a species or an ecosystem, like a human society, is an immortal body composed of mortal beings. To be mortal is not to be at risk of death, it is to be fated to die, which is why some pessimistic philosophers have said that life is an illness from which no one recovers. But the immortal bodies, though killable, are exempt from this fatality. It is the immortal bodies that, in all their tremendous yet finite variety, acts of extinction destroy. In doing so, extinction attacks life at a level that killing, even mass killing, may not reach. Killing removes a sentient individual from life. Acts of extermination mutilate, deform, reduce, or destroy the immortal living world from which killing removes the individual, a living world that is also, of course, the one in which and through which the individual lives and seeks fulfillment if left unkilled. None of this is to say that extermination is necessarily more awful than unsystematic killing. It is only to say that it is new and different, that it damages life on a whole new scale and at a new level, and therefore demands new thought and new response. Again, to put it in religious language, I'd say it's more and more as if through our actions we are flinging the creation back in the Creator's face, as if to say, this wasn't good enough for us. We expected something better. Or as if to say, we weren't rich enough. We weren't powerful enough. We didn't have a big enough car. And we can say of all of this, I think, what George Kennan once said of nuclear weapons: this is an offense offered to God. Now, I've been reading some books about global warming, just to wind up here, and one of them by Bill Nordhaus here at Yale. There are two fine books, by the way, his book and one by Gus Speth, which make for a nice debate, I should think. But anyway, the one by Nordhaus seeks to put a dollar value on the destruction by global warming, and then to compare that to the dollar value of remedial efforts if you would sort of invest that money over years. So at the end of the day, you're comparing the cost of the solution and the cost of doing nothing. And I was driven, a little bit distracted by this, and I couldn't figure out what it was that I objected to until I realized that, when you're dealing with the extinction of species and ecosystems, you're talking about something that continues once done forever. It's gone forever. It's eternal, and I'd like to know how the economists figure what is eternal into their equations. Well, we're at the Divinity School, so when eternity comes into the equation, surely we are dealing with matters spiritual. Even more clearly, we are dealing with matters biblical, because what we seem to have embarked on right now is is Genesis in reverse. The great artificer made a destroyer. The maker made an unmaker, and that is us. And I think that's our dilemma. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schell. Many disturbingly rich themes to take up in the conversation after. Let me introduce Mr. Granoff. Jonathan Granoff is president of the Global Security Institute. He's co-chair of the Blue Ribbon Task Force on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and senior advisor to the National Security Committee of the International Law section of the American Bar Association. He serves on many boards, including the World Wisdom Council, the Global Dialogue Institute, the Jane Goodall Institute, and a number of others. And he's the author of numerous publications on nuclear weapons, ethics, and law, some of which you can find downstairs on the table I've seen. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Granoff.
Thank you very much. Nuclear weapons represent a thoroughly modern dilemma whereby the means of pursuing security actually undermine security itself. The more we perfect this device, the less security we obtain. In a way, we've forgotten the why, and we've become so preoccupied with the how. And to follow Jonathan Schell is a great honor, because there are very few authors of our time with such eloquence and scope and depth. So he reminded me of this why and how. And when we become preoccupied with the how over the why, we end up with art without beauty, philosophy without truth, medicine without healing, law without justice, religion without transcendence or moral compass, and weapons without security. And that's really where we are. There was a professor here at Yale, Robert Jay Lifton, who described part of the problem as a collective form of psychic numbing. Because when you contemplate the horrific impact of nuclear weapons, you either have to really confront this absolute, as the International Court of Justice said, absolute ultimate evil, head on and grasp it in its fullness, or you simply have to turn off. You can't kind of have it halfway. I think most people find it to be a little bit too difficult. And that's one of the reasons why it's so significant and important that theologians give people the spiritual, psychic capacity to deal with this. Because I believe that the only way of overcoming evil is through love. And nuclear weapons represent the ultimate quest of the love of power. And the theological message has to be that we believe in the power of love, despite the evidence of our time and our senses and so forth, despite the fact that the body might be given up, despite the fact that history may appear to deny the possibility of redemption. And that's what faith is about, in my opinion. And nuclear weapons are a total denial of that faith, a willingness to destroy all life on the planet Earth in an afternoon. What is worth that? What is worth, what idea, what ideology, what human creation is worth that? The mayor of Nagasaki testified, the explosion of the atomic bomb generated an enormous fireball, 200 meters in radius, almost as though a small sun had appeared in the sky. The next instant, a ferocious blast wave of heat assailed the ground with a thunderous roar. The surface temperature of the fireball was about 7,000 degrees centigrade, and the heat rays that reached the ground were 3,000 degrees centigrade. The explosion instantly killed or injured people within a 2-kilometer radius of the hypercenter, leaving innumerable corpses charred like clumps of charcoal scattered in the ruins near the hypercenter. In some cases, not even a trace of the person's remains could be found. A wind over 680 miles per hour slapped down trees, demolishing most buildings. Even iron-reinforced concrete structures were so badly damaged that they seemed to have been smashed by a giant hammer. The fierce flash of heat, meanwhile, melted glass, left metal objects contorted like strands of taffy, and the subsequent fires burned the ruins of the city to ashes. Nagasaki became a city of death, where not even the sound of insects could be heard. After a while, countless men, women, and children began to gather for a drink of water at the banks of the nearby Urakami River, their hair and clothing scorched, their burnt skin hanging off in sheets like rags. Begging for help, they died one after another in the water or in heaps on the banks. Then radiation began to take its toll, killing people like a scourge of death, expanding in concentric circles from the hypercenter. For months after the atomic bombing, 74,000 people were dead, 75,000 had suffered injuries. 2/3 of the city population had fallen victim to this calamity that came upon the city of Nagasaki, like a preview of the apocalypse. Now, during the Cold War, the doctrine of the possession of nuclear weapons was an interesting doctrine. We have the nuclear weapons, we have them at the ready in order to prevent them from ever being used. Kind of a paradox. But the willingness to use them was part of deterrence, because it only works if people believe you're willing to use it. And yet, there was at least an underlying moral condemnation of the weapon. But doctrine now in our country is the legitimacy of the preemptive use of nuclear weapons based on inferring the intentions of a potential enemy. Plus, under the Nuclear Posture Review of 2002, the integration of nuclear weapons into conventional warfighting strategy, thus lowering the threshold and rendering morally acceptable the use of nuclear weapons. And if that is not an abomination that every minister in this country should address, I don't know what is. It flies in the face of our national identity, for we have a duty under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons. That treaty was created from the United States because after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the KGB and the CIA looked very carefully at the issue of nuclear weapons and concluded that absent some legal constraint, there would be dozens of nuclear weapon states by the 1970s. So Richard Nixon ensured the entry into force of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which contained within it a bargain that said, if you constrain yourself from developing nuclear weapons, you will have the benefit of nuclear energy. And the 5 nuclear weapon states, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, promised to move toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. But the world didn't trust us in 1970, and they said, we'll come back in 25 years to determine whether or not the treaty will be indefinitely extended. So in 1995, the countries of the world came back together, and the United States solemnly pledged, along with the other nuclear weapon states, to move toward the elimination of nuclear weapons in exchange for the indefinite extension of the treaty. And the promise contained within it that every 5 years the treaty would be reviewed. So in 2000, at the first review of the treaty, where the disarmament pledge had to be reviewed, all but 3 nations in the world, all but 3 in 2000, those 3 being India, Pakistan, and Israel, who stayed outside of the treaty, agreed, made an unequivocal undertaking to obtain the total elimination of nuclear weapons, and laid out 13 practical steps that would make the world safer, lower no country's security interests, and move toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. What were those things? And look at how reasonable they are. A test ban treaty, a cutoff on the production of fissile material, and especially when we're talking about terrorism. If there's anything that makes sense, is get control of the materials. Lowering the operational status of the weapons, making the cuts between Russia and the United States irreversible, And in fact, our ambassador at that said that those commitments is our guiding light for a non-proliferation and disarmament efforts of the United States and all the nuclear weapon states. And in 2005, our ambassador went to the 2005 conference, which was the second review conference, and said, we won't have our previous commitments reviewed. We only want to talk about non-proliferation issues. We will not have our disarmament commitments reviewed. Essentially saying, promises we make to this body today, we will not be held to account tomorrow. Attacking the institution of the rule of law itself. So now we have a situation where we're saying the rule of law and our commitment to fulfilling our legal responsibilities and our promises to the rest of the world can be tossed aside flippantly, wantonly, brazenly, egregiously. And the rest of the world looks and says, well, what is America about? Your Constitution says that treaties are the supreme law of the land. You've made this commitment, and yet you've increased the likelihood of use, and you will not be held to account to the rest of us. So I say, in facing the ultimate evil, if we don't have the reins of law and morality, where are we placing our faith?
Thank you, Mr. Granoff. A response?
Yes, Jonathan spoke of nuclear weapons as the ultimate expression of a love for power, which I think is absolutely correct. I would add to that seeming power. One of the things that I've had a chance to do, and because I'm teaching a course on this at Yale College each spring, is to go back over the various crises of the nuclear age. And I know there are differing views on this. And you will find moments in history, the crises, much forgotten crises over the islands of Quemoy and Natsu in the 50s, two of them under the Eisenhower administration. Nuclear threats were very, very subtly made, and also by Truman during the Korean War. But you'll be very, very hard to find any concrete result or positive outcome in terms of the policymakers flowing from those threats. One that I just want to mention because I think it's so striking, because Jonathan spoke of that switch from a deterrence policy, which at least had the virtue of saying that the point of the thing is not to blow ourselves up, not to use these things. The difference between that and the preemptive or preventive use of conventional and nuclear weapons, which does contemplate use just in a straight-out military way. I've just been reading this new book by Barton Gellman called The Angler. I have it in my briefcase over here. And it seems that around January of 2003, there was lots of chatter in the intelligence world, what they call chatter of worry about a terrorist attack. Maybe there was something to it. Maybe there wasn't. It didn't develop. You may remember that there was an orange alert at that time. But anyway, the top policymakers became convinced that some big attack was afoot, and they also became convinced that it was or probably going to be with a nuclear weapon. And so they went through a whole process. It seems a little crazy, frankly, but they went through a whole process of asking, well, if that's so, then where might it have come from? Well, not North Korea, not really. Well, who then? Well, Iran. And so what they resolved to do, and Gellman has to say that he wasn't able to find out whether this was ever actually done, but there was a decision taken, whether executed or not, to deliver a sort of non-message message. They had some language like this through unofficial channels to Iran, that if you try anything like this, you will be blown off the face of the earth. And they made it clear that this would be done with nuclear weapons. So this is an example of that, of where this policy, the present policy, can lead. By the way, there was no substantiation. There was no proof that Iran had anything to do with this attack, which itself didn't materialize, of course. So this is the world we're living in now.
Yeah. My biggest concern is human error. Or some kid hacking into the computer system in Delhi or Lahore. Remember in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had 13 days. They have 300 seconds. And we think, we look at situations through the very myopic prism of the United States. But we are downwind. The weakest link in the human chain now affects us all. The human security chain is what I mean to say, the relationship between India and Pakistan. And the idea that we would shift from seeing that the nuclear weapon itself is abhorrent to the nuclear weapon is only abhorrent in the hands of evil countries, that we would enhance the arsenals of India and say nothing about Pakistan moving toward disarmament, that as if they're so responsible there. And we forget that there have been numerous near misses. In 1983, the computers lit up in the then Soviet Union, indicating that there was a full-scale attack from the United States. And one colonel, Stanislav Petrov, didn't pass on the information up the chain of command because he knew there would be inadequate time to reasonably evaluate it. And when they were either going to court-martial him or give him awards for saving the world, they didn't know quite what to do. And I interviewed him for a documentary that's going to come out this year. And I said, where did you have the humility and the wisdom to stand up and break the protocols? And he said, well, I was a computer engineer, so I knew that computers make errors. And I didn't, and then he said, and I didn't think God wanted the world to end. So the issue in the court-martial consideration was not, the generals were not really that upset about his breaking the protocols or that concerned that he had saved the world. He said they were really angry that he believed in God. No man should have to make that decision. No human being. Boris Yeltsin in 1995 had 8 minutes to decide whether we would be here today when a weather satellite off the coast of Norway looked like a Trident launch. He had 8 minutes. What if he'd had a fight with his kids? Or he was drunk? I mean, this isn't something that people should have to decide. This is such a basic moral issue. I almost thought like my speech would be nuclear weapons and theological concerns. Duh. But it's not, because it's not being preached from the pulpits. It's not being taught at Yale Divinity School as a moral imperative. It is not being taught in the evangelical community as the greatest affront to the reverence of life. And it's not being talked about in any sane, rational way in our media. So it's not duh. It's the duh is, how do we overcome this inertia?
I would like us, by the end of this hour, to come out with a sense of what we can, as citizens, do, in a sense. And I think both Mr. Granoff and Mr. Schell have impressed upon us, obviously, the gravity of the predicament that our civic discussion faces, and both have, in their own way, noted that we have either grown tired of talking about apocalypse, as Mr. Schell says in the beginning of his book, The Seventh Decade, or that we have difficulties wrapping our moral imagination around the problem, as Mr. Granoff says. And I am struck, and I didn't expect, that in both of their opening remarks that the religious register would have such a prominent place. And I'm not sure if it's the environs you felt especially invited to talk about God and the religious.
Just pandering. No.
Yes, right.
No,
but
not really.
I would like to just make that a point of focus for the moment and ask whether you think that religious language, religious registers, religious metaphors, convictions, whatever it may be, is important for recovering a public, sane, national discussion about nuclear dangers. Mr. Shawn.
I am not a institutionalized religious person, as a matter of fact, but I find that the religious conceptions, let's say, are at the deepest level the best for comprehending what's at stake here. So as a kind of humanist, I feel free to borrow, so to speak. And, you know, I mentioned that we seem to be running Genesis in reverse. we seem to, in other words, the nuclear weapon, and I want to add in these other perils that we've engineered for ourselves, global warming and the other means of species extinction, and all the array of ways that we've invented for wrecking the earth, present a dilemma that cuts beneath any that we've ever faced before. History, it had its tragedies, heaven knows, on colossal scales, including warfare and genocide and starvation, but these were contained within a certain framework, rise and fall of states and so on. Now we've cut down into the into the foundation on which all of this stands. And here we are talking about the creation. And as a sort of a keynote for me always, and here again I find this expressed more and better and with more value for me, and I maybe for all of us than anywhere else in religious thought, is the idea of gratitude for the creation, of wonder and gratitude, awe, if you will. Don't mess with this, you know. Don't tear this up. Whatever other crazy things you do in history and so forth, don't tamper with that on which everything depends. The creation, the natural order. So that that's a fairly honest account of my appropriation of religion for my own purposes.
In the ancient Hindu texts, the Ramayana, the metaphor of the manifestation of the divine in the world, Ram has a discussion with his brother Lakshmana as they're doing battle with the evil the evil Ravana who has stolen Sita. Sita represents like the soul, and Ravana represents the ego, and Ram is the Godhead, and Lakshmana is the intellect. But it's also this huge epic on a worldly level, and it's kind of the Bible in India. And I cited this recently at a conference with Senator Roche and I were at with the Prime Minister of India and the Vice President. And in the Ramayana, Ram says to Lakshmana, who tells him, I have a weapon that can completely wipe out Ravana and everybody with him. And Ram says, by ancient tradition, this weapon is prohibited, essentially because of its indiscriminate effect. By ancient tradition, one of the oldest religious manuscripts prohibits the creation of these weapons. So I do think I think that when Oppenheimer saw it, he cited the Bhagavad Gita, I've become destroyer of worlds. And in Islam, it said if you save one life, it's as if you saved the universe. It says so in the Talmud as well. What could be more basic? And what could be more of an affront to the reverence of life, to the sense of humility in the face of this amazing journey that we get to participate in collectively? I actually think that this is a unique moment in history where there's a convergence of spiritual imperative, which is to love thy neighbor as thyself, that nations have to start taking these spiritual admonitions quite seriously, that we need to treat other nations as we want to be treated, that this has always been a spiritual admonition to see the human family as one, to have love in your heart, not kill. As a spiritual admonition. What's unique now is this has now become a practical admonition. So much so that on this issue, this past year, we found people like Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, James Baker, coming out in support of the principle of the elimination of nuclear weapons. The practical and the moral have come together. And I believe that I'm very much in accord with the way Jonathan Schell looks at this. Nukes are not just about nukes. Nukes are about how do we deal with the gift that science, technology, and our intellects have leveraged us with. And take protecting the global commons, the living systems we depend upon, the climate, the oceans, the ozone, the rainforests. 70% of the fishing stocks are in danger of being overfished. We don't know the consequences on the pH of the oceans. If one country can dump in the oceans or overfish, everybody does it under their flag. So you need a universal regime. So I ask you, in a world in which the security of some is claimed to be so superior to the security of others, where 8 nations say we have a right to have weapons of mass destruction, we claim an excessive amount of the global commons of security, do you think that countries will forsake short-term economic opportunity for long-term environmental responsibility and work together as one human community to protect the commons, the oceans, and the climate? I don't think they will. So I think that this issue is the symbolic litmus test as to whether we will work as a human community or whether we will pursue this dominance model, which I think is impractical, immoral, and illegal.
Just one sentence. I noticed that Jonathan used the word leveraging much in the news these days, and I hope we don't leverage the natural world the way Wall Street has leveraged subprime loans with results we're seeing in the headlines of our papers. That's an aside.
I want to raise one more issue, and then we're going to take a few questions from you all, so be thinking of one. You have, both Mr. Schell and Mr. Granoff have drawn parallels to climate change and to ecological problems and to other planetary emergencies. There are analogies and there are disanalogies, and it strikes me that one of the differences is that at the end of Al Gore's film, he can provide a practical list of things you can do. Go buy CFLs, for example. You both call for programs of response. Mr. Schell, I believe you used the phrase "the moral equivalent of empire," which was maybe a more robust way of talking about a global ethic. Is there a citizen's response to nuclear risk, and what does it look like? Or must we operate at the level of deep moral foundations, the cosmologies that we live by, love?
Well, individuals don't make nuclear bombs. Only states do. They're fairly complicated. They're expensive. You need the fissile material. It's states that have to do this. So that's one of the problems in creating a mass movement is we have been unable, those of us who really are committed to this issue, we've been unable to do the first principle of political organizing, which is give people something to do. So the best that we've been doing is trying to encourage people to demand of their political leaders answers. What are you doing to eliminate nuclear weapons? But I was just in Norway, and in Norway they have a windfall pension fund, from the oil profits, and they're really smart. So one of the members of the Parliamentary Network for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament, which emerged from the Middle Powers Initiative, which you will hear later from Senator Roach, which is now over 600 parliamentarians in over 70 countries with 5 women co-presidents. One of the parliamentarians in Norway put forward legislation that said the pension fund can't invest in companies that are environmentally irresponsible and that make nuclear weapons. And I thought, gee, that's what we did here in the United States with apartheid. There was a state senator in Michigan who got the teachers fund to divest itself from investments in South Africa until they would to deal with apartheid, and that had a snowballing effect. And there was a divestment movement that went in a really ripple effect into the religious community. Well, what if the religious community took the position that their funds can't be invested in companies that make weapons of mass destruction? What if Yale University had that policy? What if you started a debate in Yale that said Yale cannot invest in companies that make weapons of mass destruction? Make that a debate right here in this campus. Make that a debate starting tomorrow. Make that a moral call from the School of Divinity. This is an issue of core moral concern to us. This is as horrific as apartheid is. What about nuclear apartheid?
Nuclear apartheid, that some countries say, we're privileged, we have a right to destroy the creation and you don't. Well, the answer is not that everybody should have the right, but the answer is no one should have the right. And Yale shouldn't help that. Start a debate right here.
I just want to note that one of the more interesting arguments between Harvard and Yale is who can claim most sustainable university, and the question it turns hinges on whether one's endowment is pegged to sustainability bookmarks.
Wow, that's fabulous. So there's a precedent.
There's a debate anyway.
That's good.
Well, just very briefly, of course what you want is a social movement. Last time we had it was the early 1980s with the Freeze movement. It showed the potential that sort of it gusted up out of nowhere, and before you knew it, there were referenda passing in 8-9 states calling for a freeze legislation and so on. Then it all got sort of muddied up with Star Wars and the end of the Cold War and so on. I still think it was very influential and powerful, but it shows that that's possible. But as Jonathan says, we don't make nuclear weapons. We don't have them under our beds, so there's no way. We can't recycle them. We can't put them in the nuclear weapon bin out in front of our house. And so that's again where the spiritual aspect, the moral aspect, I think has to be dominant, because it's not a local issue. That's not true of nuclear power and nuclear waste. It does have a strong local aspect, which is very, very important and should be pursued. But the nuclear war part of it is not, strictly speaking, a local issue. So churches, universities, people who are institutions that are supposed to be caretakers of or expounders or manifestors of what we believe in a broad sense need to be central here. And I think it was that way during the freeze movement. Now, I don't know how you order up a social movement, You can run your flag up the pole, and either people salute or they don't. They react, they respond, or they don't react and they don't respond. And I don't know what plan B is when they don't respond. But you have to keep offering at the very least.
I would like at this point to see if there are questions from the audience. And Roseanne, do we have, yes, we have a traveling microphone, so if you would, yes, if you'd wait for the microphone to come your way.
Thank you. Professor Schell, I want to thank you for speaking out as you did in publishing The Fate of the Earth. I had been awakened by a snapshot that my husband brought back from from Nagasaki, because he was on the ship that first entered the harbor. And when he brought back that snapshot, that awakened me. And then you reinforced my feeling that there was something we could do about it, or should do about it. And so speaking out seems to me one way, and you were able to do that, and this panel is doing that. How can I speak out? I wrote a dissertation on conflict resolution. I've been trying to speak out about that as a social psychologist, but conflict resolution is not considered appropriate or strong enough or something. It's appeasement, according to some people. So how do we speak out to reinforce your message?
Well, speaking out is something we know how to do. As I say, it's the response that is the tough part, because you speak out and either you get a response, and sometimes you get an overwhelming response, and it's always unexpected. It always comes as a surprise. It's not something that anybody planned. Certainly it was that way back in the 1980s. But the only way to ignite such a thing, if there's a possibility out there, because there are all kinds of vehicles. There's Jonathan's organization, Global Security Institute, and there's Tyler Wigg Stevenson's organization, Faithful Security. There's a group in Washington that's got a thing called the Nuclear Compact that they're working on to advance the cause of, and to make a movie about sort of an inconvenient truth about this. I think we know, I have no new invention in the domain of, right of speech, assembly, and so forth, but there are opportunities, there are organizations that can be supported, and then we can just hope that ignition occurs and we get critical mass publicly, and we'll never know in advance when that might happen. It will catch us by surprise, that's for sure. But it's not futile.
Well, I would appreciate some support from those who have an incentive to do something. Thank you.
Go to Melissa and then...
Hi, I'm Melissa Mathis. I'm the director here of a small program, Initiative of Religion and Politics. And I wanted to ask if you could help us theologize a little bit the title of the conference, Are We Safe Yet? Because it seems to me in part that in a post-9/11 world, in part why we can't order up a social movement is because the majority of Americans don't think they're safe yet. So how would you begin to articulate in a world of suitcase nukes, or even just the imagination of suitcase nukes that are, on the subway in New York City or Chicago at any moment, how would we begin to theologize, indeed we are safe? Because well, that's enough.
I'm not quite sure what the question was, actually. How to theologize as to whether we are or are not safe? Well, from a theological point of view, we're only safe if we're saved. And, from a theological point of view, death could take us at any time. And from a national, but I think you're talking about the political safety with respect to nuclear weapons. I think that playing to the narrative of fear ensures conservative voting. I think that, I call it the Ching-Ling Long Abdul Gomez Borofsky syndrome. Now, Ching-Ling Long Abdul Gomez Borofsky can manifest as Manuel Noriega, Cesar Chavez, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, a guy named Borofsky. He is the dark, fearful shadow in our culture. But he doesn't have nuclear weapons. If he had nuclear weapons, he would have used them. He would have threatened to use them for sure. There are evil forces out there, no doubt. But if we're serious about making ourselves safe, the first thing we would do is actually put real money into safeguarding the materials. Facts. We need to get facts out. It's not the facts. The theological issue is pretty obvious, but people don't know the facts. Like the International Atomic Energy Agency has never spent more than $120 million in an entire year to do its inspections in the whole world. We spend about that much a day in our country alone on the arsenal. If we were serious about making ourselves safe, we would strengthen the international inspection regime and get control of the fissile material. Seriously. But we're not doing that. So we're not really even addressing the terrorist issue. Nuclear weapons are no value against terrorists. They're patently suicidal to use against a country that has them, and it's patently immoral to use them against a country that doesn't have them. So why do we have them? We have them because of this fear of Ching-Ling Long, Abdul Gomez Borofsky. We have them because we're operating under a paradigm that weapons bring strength, the ultimate weapon brings ultimate strength, and we don't want to let it go. But the fact is, our possession of the weapon is stimulating the proliferation of the weapon. So I think the best thing we could do would be to have an honest debate about it. We got involved in the first counter-proliferation war in Iraq when Condoleezza Rice threw a cloud of fear over the United States by saying, don't let the next 9/11 be a mushroom cloud, knowing full well that that was a lie, that was a distortion, that was a fabrication. There was no possibility that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. The IAEA had made that clear. And once she threw that out there, rational debate collapsed. And if any class of people can give people the courage to look evil in the eye and deal with it in a rational fashion, I think it's faith-based people. Is if you can't do that, If you can't give people sufficient faith to actually just look at the world as it really is, not as your fears imagine it to be, then what's the value of the preaching? It should give people enough faith to just deal with the truth. So my answer to your question is veritas fortissima. Truth is the strongest.
Go ahead. Another question. You, sir, were next, I believe.
Hi, my name is Shawn Meyer. I work with the Union of Concerned Scientists. I thought a little scientific perspective would, or at least some representation would be helpful to this conference. I've been working on these issues for my whole professional life, and I mentioned to you, Jonathan, in large part because of your book.
I already apologize to you.
I really quite skeptical of the possibility of a mass movement, and I agree with you that the freeze did have a tremendous impact on the debate. And my question is whether there are other models of success, of global success, and the one that comes to mind is the eradication of smallpox, where arguably a small group of experts and health experts came together and said, we have a problem globally and we're going to deal with it, and they did. And I wonder, in the absence of a mass movement or a new social movement, is there another model? And many other people have used the preparation for World War II as another model of when people came together and acted with mutual self-interest.
My own personal feeling, with or without a mass movement per se, that is millions of people on the streets and so forth, that the nuclear weapon is lodged so deep in our psyche that it can't be got rid of without an expression of public will. Now, whether that expression begins with the public, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't begin with the public. In a certain way, you have a truly bizarre situation that is in some respects hopeful. You have a majority of former secretaries of state and defense, plus Henry Kissinger, including Henry Kissinger and all the others that we've mentioned, saying, let's go down this road. I mean, they might be a little too slow for me, a little too cautious, but there it is in cold print, and they persist in it. So certainly one of the great barriers, maybe the greatest barrier throughout the Cold War, was that the sort of so-called nuclear priesthood absolutely dismissed out of hand any idea of getting rid of nuclear weapons. Now that barrier has fallen. Well, military people in general, I don't think, like them. They're unusable. They're useless. There's a sort of colossal futility about the whole thing, especially for the United States. Yet they are a danger to us. So the door is swinging open. So how do we get somebody to walk through? Now, of course, it might be, ultimately, it has to be a president. Maybe it will be a president, yeah. Both McCain and Obama. Obama, with a stronger expression by far than McCain, have embraced the Gang of Four, the Kissinger, etc. group. But I think it's pretty well back on the burner, to put it mildly. But they have embraced the goal. I can easily imagine the initiative coming from the Senate or coming from universities or coming from the public, which would be ideal. But eventually the public has to get on board. Maybe a big debate will get going if someone puts it forth seriously, and then we begin to have contention and so on. And maybe even the news media will get interested in it. Think of that.
Another question. Let's come here to the row.
Hi, I'm Holly. I'm an MDiv student here in my last year, and my concern is both as an American, as a Christian, as a pastor in training, I am increasingly troubled by what I see as a clash over God, by a number of warring factions in this national dialogue who seek to supposedly have an honest dialogue, but claim God is on their side, that their view is the chosen view, so that it becomes difficult, if not impossible, certainly veiled, to have an honest dialogue about, for example, an appreciation for creation without getting down to a woman's choice over her reproductive rights. And so I think my question is, how would you all suggest that we might help to elevate the national dialogue to a higher level or a practical level where we don't fight over God and the will of God, not that any of us truly know, but how can we embrace the theology into our practical understanding and seeking of truth in the future?
Well, I think that to some extent you have to meet the issue head on of those who feel that the whole world is fallen and that only their group is saved. And you have to meet that issue head on, and that they don't have a right to put creation at risk, that there's this preoccupation with individual fetuses, but a complete ignoring of killing everybody. It's like, is the 11th commandment, thou shalt not kill, everybody? They don't seem to be offended by that. Why? Because of a eschatology relating to the rapture and these sort of things. And I think they just need to be called to the carpet and straight out. I mean, in America, there's two major, I think there's two major theological narratives as it relates to the state. One is the narrative of Tom Paine and the Quakers in Philadelphia, where the light of God is in everybody. They tried to move that way. They didn't quite do it at the convention in 1787. But the idea that the authority of the state comes from the will of the people, and that the conscience of the people can speak, and the state has that authority. It's an egalitarian spirituality. It's a very unique American idea in political philosophy. But in order to address those others who would believe that their singular interpretation of Scripture is the be-all and end-all, they said, let's put a barrier between church and state so there couldn't be that manipulation. There's also another narrative, which is that we are we go back to the covenant at Plymouth Rock, and that's the basis of authority, that we are a special national narrative, whereas we have a special destiny and a right and a duty to impose our will on the world. That's a dominance model, and its expression has now found itself in the concept of ruling through law rather than being ruled by the rule of law, the idea of the unitary executive independent of checks and balances, the idea of Stratcom, which does our nuclear planning, calling for, through the U.S. Space Command, which is under their command, and I quote, full spectrum dominance of the whole planet Earth. That's their language. Now, that's a theological concept. I think it's blasphemy. The idea that any small group of people would want to have full spectrum dominance of the world. That's God's duty. So I actually think that the best thing is to say, well, there's places where we commune, there's places where we have dialogue, and there's places where we simply have to debate the issue. And I would call this issue a debate issue.
Did you want to say something else? I believe next was you, sir, in the back.
Thank you. My name is Paul Hodel. I'm a graduate of YDS and a Quaker. And I had the good fortune to be working with William Sloane Coffin as a local organizer. I think the Divinity School should send out a call to all graduates, clergy, and lay people who are active in churches and synagogues, in Muslim faith, in Buddhist faith, whatever, and we should be having dialogues within our local communities to do local organizing to expand our movement. And I think it should come right from today. We should make that call. Also, I think that calling for a divestment from nuclear weapons and all militarism would be very good. And I, having been involved in the nuclear freeze campaign, we found here in Connecticut how ingrained the military is throughout our state, and I know it is throughout the entire country. And I think a nationwide divestment movement would be a wonderful creative idea for us to offer here. And the last thing I wanted to say was that I've also been involved in the ecological movement with the forestry school. The Divinity School and forestry school are working together. Gus Speth has raised some very important ideas about challenging the capitalist system. I think ultimately this is an issue of liberation to overcome our being enslaved to the nuclear military industrial complex and really enabling people to free themselves, to free each other, and to live fully in God's creation.
Thank you. I'll just take that as well received, and I'll note that I believe that one of the next issues of our Reflections magazine, which goes out to all of our alumni, will be on just this issue with content from this conference, so, and that may spark the kind of debate that you're asking for. Let's have time for one more question. Want to go to the other side of the room here? Yeah.
And with global climate change, global warming being at such the forefront of our national dialogue right now, what do you say about nuclear power, given that we have no way to dispose of nuclear waste? And what kind of message should we be sending to, what kind of dialogue should we be having as a nation about nuclear power?
I'll answer what is a vast subject that could take up many hours, of course, and in which I am not as versed as I feel I should be. The aspect of it that I feel well versed in is the nexus between nuclear power and proliferation. They're talking about a renaissance of nuclear power around the world, the idea that nuclear power is going to take up the slack on energy and help head off global warming. You know, the waste issues, you'd have to ask someone else about it. The safety issues also to get a subtle or detailed discussion. But what's absolutely clear to me is that an acceleration of nuclear power will greatly worsen the proliferation problem. These are two branches. The bombs and the power plants are two branches on one tree. And it's impossible to train thousands and thousands of scientists for power and spread that technology all around the world. You know, the uranium and the plutonium, these are the same elements that are used for the bomb, and what comes out of the back end of a plutonium reactor can be used for a bomb. There's some debate about that, but it can be used for a bomb. And so from that point of view alone, I could not support this idea of solving global warming or even just a partial solution through the expansion of nuclear power. That's about as far as I go.
Thanks. I wanted to leave a few minutes here at the end for, I'm instructed to let Tyler have his
He
have
worked
his
to
question.
make the conference.
Yes, absolutely. Tyler.
I hope this isn't presumptuous, but wanted to make a comment on a question, and since I'm not sitting up there, I probably shouldn't, but here I am. I think that there's a temptation to think that everything we do has to have immediate results. And the thing is, we don't have that luxury with nuclear weapons. And so I just wanted to encourage the lot of us as we go into lunch to start asking, you know, if we're coming at this from an explicitly faith perspective, is faith about quick results? Or is the job that we're called to do a parallel creation of a culture that finds nuclear weapons untenable, such that when the issue finally comes to a political head 10 years from now, say, we have slowly changed the culture in a way that we've done our work in our churches, we've formed people to theologically analyze the world, we've helped bring people out of fear and into a more hopeful existence. And then, trying to say what can faith do leads to all these And this is my business, so I indulge in all these sort of impotent moral, religious statements all the time, and politicians don't really care. I mean, they're good. It's better than nothing, but they don't really care. So I guess I wanted to encourage people to take inventory of who you are and where you are and figure it out. So where are you? Are you in the business community? What sources of power do you have? Where do you speak to? What can you change? And it's not going to eliminate a bomb overnight, but it is a comprehensive task, and I think it requires avoiding the laziness of wanting an immediate political result, which is frankly impossible. If I raise the tone of my voice at the end of that sentence, it might sound like a question. A question?
Well, I'm going to take that as, in fact, our final commissioning here. My two panelists, Mr. Granoff and Mr. Schell, have indicated that they will reserve their summation for lunch conversations.